you can hear me, can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Okay, great. Welcome everyone, Bill Balzer here. I'm gonna start timing me for a 10-minute Thinkinar, and I'm gonna be talking about the alignment of institutional practices to support Lean. So let's just jump right into it. Is Lean implementation sustainable? And what does the research say? Well, a study in 2017, dissertation study, suggested that the percentage of organizations that actually can continue Lean after implementation is really kind of low. The overall rate is about 10 to 15% in the studies that were reported. So, which would suggest it to be a pretty high failure rate in organizations. So the question is, why such a high failure rate? And lots of hypotheses why that might be the case. It may be that Lean works, but it isn't being done correctly. You with a rapid improvement event, you do poor scoping, so it dies off because you're not doing it well. Or maybe it's because the Lean you're doing is not really Lean. That is, it's not showing respect for people, so it dies off. Lots of reasons, lots of hypotheses, but I'm going to focus on the green star reason, which is Lean as a large-scale change is poorly implemented and unable to succeed. So if poorly implemented Lean efforts fail, just like any other poorly implemented large-scale change effort is going to fail. So if you remember one thing from today's Thinkinar, my takeaway is to support and sustain Lean, you need to align all of your institutional practices, or as many as you can, okay? Now you're going to ask, well, what are these institutional practices? So my background is industrial organizational psychology. So as a psychologist, work psychologist, we look at what are all the forces that are working together to get every employee in the organization to do his or her job in a way that we need to do it, them to do it for the organization to be effective. So some of these will probably look familiar to you. Workplace climate is a force that shapes how people do their jobs. Leadership practices, the words and actions of a leader, that directs the employee's work behaviors. There's a whole host. I use in my consultation, I use these 11 institutional practices. So, just mentioning a couple with the green stars, but I use the 11. Now, here's a graphic that shows you what we're sort of aiming for. To the right of the graph is where you have successful implementation of Lean management systems to support the mission of the organization. And each of these 11 institutional practices is supposed to be having a big fat arrow pointing in the right direction. But typically in organizations, these are often misaligned. So if you look at the green star personnel practices, you'll see that, yeah, that's working exactly the way it should be. Personnel practices are aligned with Lean. They're going to make the organization effective. If you look at the yellow star leadership practices, not really. It's not doing any harm. It's not pulling away from where you're trying to go, but it isn't pulling you in that direction either. And it's a small arrow, so not that much influence. But if you look at the red star for motivation and reward practices, that's pulling in the opposite direction. There's something about those practices in your organization that aren't supporting Lean. So what you need to do is move to some sort of structured approach to figure all this out. You need to do organizational analysis where you can figure out where the misalignment is. Then you move to organizational development to improve the alignment of those practices. Then we move through to organizational effectiveness when you've got full alignment, when they're all pushing or all moving in the same direction. How do you do that? Well, the things we were just talking about, there's a lot of great Lean tools that fit in here. PDCA, continuous improvement, these are just very robust Lean tools. So the step one is you'd analyze the current alignment of your institutional practices with Lean. You can do surveys, interviews, focus groups, look at institutional records and reports, lots of ways to get there. That's the P of PDCA. Then in step two, you can then start to selectively begin to align your institutional practices with Lean. So for example, you might want to think, what are my criteria for choosing which interventions I'm going to work on now? Which one do I think is going to have the most impact? How difficult is it to do it? How much time do I have? What's the cost of changing that institutional practice? So maybe you use the Lean tool of a pick chart to say, this is the one I'm going to use first. and that's where you go with. That's the DCA of PDCA. And then step 3, it's this ongoing assessment or aligning the continuous improvement of your institutional practices over time through Lean implementation. So you ultimately want to expand the alignment of all your institutional practices with Lean so that they're fully redundant and consistent and sustain the change even when one of them starts to break down on you. So if we looked at an example, personnel practices, down the left column, you'll see some examples of personnel practices. I'm going to focus on 2. For recruitment, what would alignment with Lean look like? Well, you're going to highlight during recruitment respect for people. You're going to show that there are opportunities to work independently and own a process. You're going to show that Lean is a demonstrated strategy for best in class. What do you do during onboarding? The second green star. You're going to talk about Lean as a strategy and management system and how we use it throughout the organization. How your job relates to the mission of the institution. How you'll use continuous improvement in your daily work. How, when you're onboarding leaders, your coaches are not problem solvers. You're going to teach your employees how to be problem solvers. So there are lots of other personnel practices we could be talking about. You can do it for all the other institutional practices. I'll just highlight 2 with the green stars. Job design and roles. Instead of being that typical organization where maybe there's limited opportunity to change work, role ambiguity due to job design, supervisors supervise but don't know how to do the work themselves. In a Lean aligned, it would be clear role responsibility, showing that role interdependence, building cross-functional teams, using that improvement kata, DMAIC or PDCA, whatever works for you. Within power and influence, the other institutional practice at the bottom, instead of top-down supervision due to centralized power, or that influence is confounded with where you are in the chart, you have empowered employees who can pull that andon cord and can actually stop work in that organization. That's having power and influence. Or where the leadership kata is taught, where you're teaching people how to have influence and success in their work. Or where it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, your Lean experience is respected. And then if you wanted to do a deeper dive, if we looked in organizational design and structure, again, institutional practice on the left, Lean aligned on the right, the 2 green stars, vertical differentiation, how tall or flat is your organization? Rather than decision-making power decreasing as you move down the organization, we actually push decision-making down to the people who know the process. Or in the work unit design, rather than grouping them by function into what we call stovepipes or silos, we actually put them into process families, which respect those workflow interdependencies.
Hey, Bill, we just hit our 2 minutes.
So here's the dream. You would have full alignment of those institutional practices, all the arrows, all pulling in exactly the same direction towards a Lean management system and to support the mission of the organization. So recommendations from a Lean researcher and 40-year-old practicing work psychologist. You can use Lean philosophy, principles, and practices to determine what are those best practices that are going to get us to become a Lean organization, to support and sustain a Lean organization. You analyze your organization. You align as many practices as you can. And if you can only focus on 2 to get started, start with workplace climate and leadership. Those have been shown to be the most influential ones. Get the flywheel turning. As more things start to become successful, leverage that success and align even more institutional practices as time, resources, etc. permit. Every aligned institutional practice supports and sustains Lean, and the more the better. And there's the takeaway, to support and sustain Lean as a large-scale change. And thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit today. You can find out more about this in my book that just came out recently, Lean Higher Education, Increasing the Value and Performance of University Processes. If you're in higher ed, you might enjoy this. Otherwise, you can contact me at wbalzer@bgsu.edu, or you can go to my website, leanhighereducation.com. Great. Will anything pop up that I can respond to in the last 25 seconds?
I don't see anything. I think we're going to be moving speakers any second now.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great seminar.
Thank you.